everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. I'm Butchart, and welcome to Politics, Power and Production, the Global Impact of Denim. This is a conversation and creativity talk for the British Textile Biennial, which is presented by Creative Lancashire, a service provided by Lancashire County Council. So this evening, I'm joined by an incredibly esteemed panel of guests. We're going to be talking through some of their work and research as it relates to this notion of the global symbolism of denim and power and politics of denim as well. Following that, we will have some time, hopefully, for questions from the audience. So if you have any burning questions that come up throughout the discussion, please do keep them in mind for the end. Okay, so if I could introduce this fantastic panel. Firstly, we have Sophie Woodward. Sophie is a professor of sociology at the University of Manchester, and she carries out research into fashion, clothing, particularly denim, and wardrobes, as well as dormant things as well. For example, things people no longer use, but they are keeping. She also researches feminist theory as well. Sophie is the author of 5 books, including Why Women Wear What They Wear, and Blue Jeans, The Art of the Ordinary, which we'll be finding out more about shortly. Harris Elliott is a multidisciplinary artist, cultural curator, and academic, with an extensive portfolio working in fashion, music, and art. Culture without compromise is Elliott's studio mantra, a statement of intent refined through 20 years of inspired global working with heavy emphasis in Japan and Jamaica. Harris is a senior lecturer in fashion at the Royal College of Art and Central St Martin's, and in 2021, earlier this year, he launched the art-based collaborative conversation platform Lettings, which we will be hearing more about later also. This is an alter ego of his main studio expressions, building upon nuanced African diaspora references through visuals and sound. Tiwirayi Ndoro is next. She is a fashion promotion with styling graduate, specialising in fashion photography and styling from the University of Central Lancashire. You may have seen Tiwi on an event earlier today, right here in the cathedral. She's also the winner of the 2020 Fashion and Textiles Award by Creative Lancashire. Tiwirayi's work is very much an expression of her experience, being a Black British woman while still embracing her Zimbabwean heritage. She is passionate about the development and progression of young people and aims to encourage and inspire young people through her work and community youth work as a director of CIC project CIC in Manchester. And last but very much not least, we have Craig Oldham. Craig has been named as one of the most influential designers working in the UK and has written books on a range of topics, including education, culture, and politics. Alongside his practice, Office of Craig, he's creative director of Rough Trade Books, and he teaches at various institutions as well. Now, to begin with, I wanted to start thinking about the ubiquity of denim. Now, this is really clear from some research that Sophie did with another academic, Daniel Miller, and together they wrote Manifesto for a Study of Denim, which seems like the perfect place to begin. In this, they wrote, "We counted the proportion of persons wearing denim blue jeans out of the first 100 to pass by on random streets in sites such as Istanbul, London, Rio, Manila, Seoul, and San Francisco. This proportion ranged from 34 to 68%, suggesting that soon, at any given moment, more than half the world will be wearing this single textile, which is quite remarkable. It truly is a global fabric. Denim is something we can all relate to, and I think all of us on the panel tonight are in fact wearing it. Well done, guys, on brand, good, like it. So this is really an interesting point as well when we are considering denim as a fabric of protest and counterculture, which is what we're going to be thinking about this evening. So to everyone, I wanted to start off with quite a personal question. What is your own relationship with denim? Let's start with Sophie.
I think that researching denim has basically ruined my relationship with denim. So I used to have a pretty much entirely unself-conscious relationship to denim in that I wore it, I loved it, and then as soon as I started researching it, everything was loaded with significance, and I thought, I can't wear those jeans, I can't wear that brand. And doing research on it, which I've been doing since 2005, I think that actually it kind of completely transformed that. But I do still have one of the things I've done is research into people's kind of favourite or oldest pair of jeans, and I do still really vividly remember this pair of jeans I had when I was younger, which used to be my mum's, and they were from the 1970s, and they were original Levi's, and they'd kind of been worn down, and when I wore them you could feel on the knees that they went softer, and they were just kind of magical. And for me that was like exactly what denim and jeans should do. It's the ways in which they change, they develop with you, and they take on your body. Unfortunately, they have died, but I still remember them very fondly.
Lovely. Harris?
My introduction to denim, growing up, denim wasn't really something that we had in our house, and that came from my mum not seeing denim as something that was particularly smart, and so she was very insistent that denim wasn't something that me or my siblings would wear. But then in my early 20s, I remember seeing this guy around town. His name's Bio, it's around London, and he was always wearing this particular brand of jeans, and I never knew him at the time, but it was this brand from Japan, Christopher Nemeth. And when I finally discovered, and I'm wearing Nemeth now, there's a really amazing intricate cut that Christopher would always put into his jeans, and for me, I was then always looking out for these other ways in which brands or designers would rework denim in a way that I could fit into my wardrobe. So it was more about how I or people that I looked at were able to kind of manipulate denim in a way that you would do with any other fabric, and not in the ways that I'd grown up seeing it.
Lovely.
Yeah. I think for me, denim, as any young girl out in these streets would see denim is like, I just thought it was a trend piece, like just something that I could wear that was convenient, that kind of went with everything. I had no real connection with denim apart from that until I started doing a bit of research and came up with like my project, the Warwick Denim Project, and that made me realise the significance that denim has. Yeah, that's me.
Lovely. And we'll be talking much more about Tiwirayi's project shortly.
I don't really have any kind of academic or research-based kind of interest in denim. To me, it's like it's sort of totemic, and I love it's like the reverse of other clothing. It's like it's at it for me anyway. It's at its shittest when it's brand new. For me, I love it that it wears in, and it's something that kind of grows with you and becomes better and better the longer and older it is. And I think that is just something really, really lovely, that you can treasure something, a piece of clothing, like you would anything else, and it ages better, a bit like leather, I guess. But yeah, that for me is just, I think it's amazing.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's that, I think everybody, or so many people, are interested in that aging process of denim and the fact that it just moulds to you. And I know when I came to Blackburn earlier in the month, or at the end of last month, to work on the install of the exhibition I have here at the moment, I brought denim dungarees to wear because I was working, and it was, and I love them and they're comfortable. And I was gutted to find out on the train, before I even got here and started work, they actually had rips in them, because I've had them for so long and I've worn them so much. I was like, I've worn through my workwear before I've started work. What am I going to do? And I still haven't got them fixed, but I will get them fixed. But it's definitely that kind of tactile quality, I think, isn't it, that so many people have a relationship with. Okay, so we're seeing here an image of one of Sophie's projects, the Global Denim Project, which is a sort of academic hub, I suppose, that contains an awful lot of research projects, all focused on denim. So I was wondering if you could talk us through this project a bit, how it came about, and some of the projects that are active on the site.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the starting point for this was way back a long, long time ago when I was doing my PhD, so 2004, 2005, and the research was into women's wardrobes. And as I was doing that, I was struck by how much, on a daily basis, women were wearing jeans, and yet that comprised such a tiny part of their wardrobe. And I thought, what's going on here? So I went out to go and read about jeans, and everything I could find in the literature was about the American history of jeans, and so the history of cowboys, of kind of movie stars, of the history essentially of Americana. And whilst I think that's really interesting and that's an important story of denim, for me that didn't even come close to accounting for why people were wearing jeans today. And also it didn't come close to accounting for the fact that it is a global fabric. Blue jeans are a global item of clothing. They are globally ubiquitous. And so as a consequence, I think, so Daniel Miller, he was my PhD supervisor, we worked together to develop global denim, because if denim is a global fabric, then we need a global project to understand that. And the project started with the manifesto paper that you've already mentioned. And essentially it was a kind of, a call to arms to say, listen, we think this is absolutely fascinating. We want more people to work on it. And it worked. And we ended up with, I think, 20 or maybe even more projects of people who were either already working on denim or who said, yeah, okay, let me come and do some work on denim. And as a consequence, we developed this project. So it developed very organically. We didn't kind of predetermine in every country you must look at this exact same thing. So we've got research in there on consumption, we've got research on production, we've got research on not every country in the world, but quite a few regions of the world covered. So, for example, our own research was on blue jeans in London, but there's also research, for example, a project on, just to highlight a couple of them, a project on denim and Bollywood. So Claire Wilkinson-Weber looked at costume designers in Bollywood, and her research kind of charted the ways in which, if you looked on Bollywood films in the early 1970s, there was almost no jeans in the films. Now, on one level, that seems unsurprising because these films are kind of about spectacular clothing and display, but gradually but they're also very fashion forward, and you start to see the emergence of some male kind of heroes wearing jeans in the 70s, and then as the 70s go on, increasingly some female heroes, but they certainly weren't mainstream. And in many ways, that maybe mirrored aspects of Indian society at the time. So the research was done in Mumbai. But actually, you look at Bollywood films now, and as she, argues in her research, there was an explosion in the wearing of denim. Denim is absolutely everywhere. And so it's really interesting to think about these kind of regional histories of denim, which aren't just accounted for by Americana, even though in the 70s jeans there were associated with America. But what America means in Mumbai and Bollywood is very different to what it might mean in, for example, London. And so actually, when we're thinking about denim and we're thinking about the associations of the global or of America, they mean very different things in different contexts. So one of the arguments for having all of these different research projects into denim is that each area has its own local histories. It has its own local understandings of the global and of America, and that to really understand denim, we need to do these histories. So just to highlight one other project briefly, there was a project done in Hungary and looking at socialist histories and the links to the wearing of jeans. So Ferenc Hammer carried out some research looking at, he asked people for their memories of their first ever pair of jeans. And this was people who'd lived in Hungary, and it's between kind of the 1960s and 1980. And what's really fascinating that comes out of people's memories of their first pair of jeans was how much this told us about socialist history, how much it told us about what it was like to live in a country, in that particular period of time. He uses it to tell this story about the changing relationship between the state and its citizens. And what's really interesting in terms of the ideas of protest as well is that actually, on one level, we see an explosion in the wearing of jeans in that period. And on one level, it was kind of approved by the state in terms of it was about showing that we have a really good local economy, and they collaborated with Levi Strauss during that. But also, actually, when you look at these personal stories of wearing jeans, you can see how it's not just about compliance, it's not about homogeneity. There are also clear everyday acts of resistance, and how actually, on one level, you could say, okay, this is locally a completely homogeneous wearing of jeans because everybody was wearing them. But actually, when you get those personal stories, you hear about the practices of authentication authentication that people go through. So things they do to change the jeans to make them theirs, or just the fact that people probably only had one pair of jeans, so they wore them every day, and they use this phrase, the second skin, which we're quite familiar with people using around clothing, but it has a massive resonance here, and it's clear that actually, yes, everyone wore them, but everyone had a personal story, and you can see how when we think about things like protest and resistance, it's actually much more subtle than often we're allowed to think about.
So fascinating. And if we could have the next slide, please. And your research, especially some of the London denim research you mentioned, but also obviously loads of other research, has made it into these two books. So could you just talk us a bit through these publications?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so the book Global Denim is in lots of ways a kind of one of the publications to come out of the Global Denim Project, and this particular book takes a series of those projects, and it takes up the task of thinking about what does denim tell us about the global, but what does global denim tell us about the world? And so one of the arguments is that we are both anthropologists. Well, I'm actually a sociologist now officially, but I still maintain those anthropological roots. And as anthropologists, we're always interested in what people do in particular contexts. And rather than say, okay, well, this is this global thing that people domesticate, they think we'll do it differently in our context. Actually, you can tell a series of local histories, of local stories. And we wanted to see what do these examples and local stories tell us about global denim and tell us about what denim is. And essentially, one of the arguments that comes from the book is that denim allows people to mediate a series of kind of oppositions between feeling like they are the most personal, intimate item in the world, but they're also the most global. They're the thing that connects you most to the world, in that you are, to kind of coin a denim brand's title, you are a citizen of humanity, but you are also wearing perhaps the most personal item you could be. So I think it's also about the idea of external influences, things that are out there, and then also what is local. And we see that played out in a lot of different kinds of contexts as well. The idea, the desire, again, an opposition between wanting to fit in and wanting to stand out. And you find that actually denim allows these kinds of oppositions in lots of different kinds of contexts. So the Global Denim book is one that takes these kind of range of different projects and puts them together to try and make this argument for the relationship between the global, the local, the personal, and the kind of generic. And Blue Jeans is one of the projects within the Global Denim Project. So that's an ethnography that I carried out with Daniel Miller, and we took 3 streets in London, in North London, and we knocked on people's doors and talked to people about their jeans. And what was really fascinating coming out of this project, and that we didn't pick any special community or anyone who's particularly interested in fashion or branding. And in many ways, the people there were very kind of typical of London. So we had people who were second generation to that very street, whose parents lived there and they lived there. We had people who were just over for the summer. We had second generation kind of immigrants. We had different kinds of countries, you know, all over the world. Almost any kind of country you could think of, there were people there. And what was really interesting was actually that Blue Jeans here were about being ordinary. And so through the book, we develop a theory of ordinariness. Now, this certainly isn't true for denim in every context, or even in other parts of London, or for all people. But for here, what we found was that jeans allowed people to be ordinary. People didn't want to stand out, they didn't want to be marked in any particular way, and jeans were the medium through which they were able to do that. And actually, we argued this was particularly important for migrant populations who, in lots of ways, were marked as different in ways that maybe they didn't want to, but the wearing of jeans was a way in which they could just get on with their lives. So one of the arguments then that the book makes is it's about ordinariness. And the other argument in there is about comfort, and we interrogate the idea of being comfortable, which is simultaneously a kind of physical sensation. It's also about personal aesthetics, and it's also about how you fit into different social contexts. And so whilst it fits in lots of kind of ideas more broadly about denim, I think we would argue that that is a particular book. And actually, if you were to do an ethnography of 3 random streets in another city in another country, you may well find a very different kind of thing, and you wouldn't find it's about ordinariness. But that was the thing that emerged from that particular project.
It's fascinating, and I'm quite intrigued to know the reaction of people when they answered the door and you were like, here to talk about your jeans. Like, how did you introduce that, and what was the reaction?
absolutely astonishingly, people were really up for it. So almost everyone said yes, and some people said, I've got nothing to say about jeans, you don't want to talk to me, and I said, I precisely want to talk to you. And generally, I don't know if they felt sorry for me because it was raining and we were in London, and they thought, oh, this poor woman, let her in. But people were willing to talk to us, and I think that was really interesting. And actually, it was really important because generally when you ask for people to volunteer, you get a particular demographic. You often get middle-aged white women. And by knocking on people's doors, we got a much wider demographic. We got, you know, kind of middle-aged men, we got young men, we got all sorts of different kinds of people. And I think as a consequence, we got a really rich narrative then about jeans. And I think we got a really interesting story that we just wouldn't have got. So actually door knocking was slightly embarrassing, but very successful.
Fantastic, that's great, thank you. If we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. These are some images from Tiwirayi's current show that's on in the mall in Blackburn, the Woke Denim Project, which is on for the rest of the month. Now, Sophie mentioned this kind of myth of the cowboy, and jeans have been associated with myth-making of America. This is a sort of really dominant narrative that we still have about jeans, including the cowboy, the Wild West, settler colonialism, violence of manifest destiny, these ideas. And through these narratives, the history of jeans with that particular telling of history has been inscribed with an inherent whiteness. So I think it's really great to see your work challenge this, Tiwirayi. And it's especially pertinent right now during Black History Month to really be interrogating these kind of dominant narratives that we're told and understanding the richer histories behind these things. So could you tell me more about the Woke Denim Project?
Amazing. So yeah, the Woke Denim Project is a 10-image photo series that kind of focuses on denim and civil rights. I decided to focus on mainly, obviously, the 60s civil rights movement, but channeling the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 with a focus on young people and how Gen Z are really making strides to kind of push these movements forward. Yeah, I used a number of members and ambassadors of a CIC in Manchester called Project CIC, which I'm the director of, and I was able to work with young people and actually even have conversations surrounding denim and their relationship with denim, and you know whether they even knew the ties that denim had to like civil rights and slavery and all of these things, and they didn't even know. I didn't know before I started working on this project, so it was great to kind of delve into the history of how Black people used to wear denim on the fields, like as workwear, and like that kind of became considered as Negro clothing, clothing that was considered only for Black people and not for the rest because they were workers. That was what they were reduced to. So it was great to kind of delve into that, and that's kind of what the project is about.
And could you tell us a bit about the CIC?
Yeah, so CIC is an organisation based in Manchester. We help young women and men aged 14 to 24, I believe, and we basically offer them opportunities to kind of grow by inspiring, developing and nurturing their talents within performing arts and also like just in life skills as well. So that's what we do.
Fantastic. And so you styled these images. Where were you sourcing the denim from?
So a lot of the denim I found in thrift stores around Manchester, and I actually got some of the models to bring in denim as well, so like their jeans, and just because I didn't want to pay into that, consumerism and like buy new things. I wanted to make sure I was using something that's authentic, that's aged, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement has aged too. So yeah, everything was thrifted.
Fantastic. And can we have the next image, please? This, I think, is some of the images that you were using as your research. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could explain, A, what denim symbolises in the images you've created, but also a bit more about the significance of denim for the civil rights movement in America at this time.
So, in my opinion, like for both, denim now symbolises something of liberty, I feel like, and liberation. I think in the past it was used to oppress Black people. Now we're using it to liberate ourselves. In this image, you can see him walking confidently. You can see him walking with a passion and a drive and an ambition to create change. And I think that is very much what I now see as what denim is and what I try to portray in my images as well.
Fantastic. And if we could see the next image as well, please. So I wanted to, these are some images from the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And there are actually some fantastic prints of images from the march available at the shop, the Cathedral pop-up shop we have here, which will be available to buy afterwards for anyone who's interested. And so I wanted to sort of throw this open to everybody with these images in mind. Like, why do you think that denim functions so well as clothing for protest? So, Sophie, I'll come back to you.
Right. I mean, I think partly, there's a number of different reasons, but I think one of them is around comes from this kind of ubiquity of it, and also the way in which it's almost kind of like a blank canvas, in that it has so many different possibilities for differentiation. And so protests kind of use denim in different and particular ways, and I think because denim has this capacity almost of being a blank canvas, it has that possibility then for being used in different kinds of ways. But I think the second element is around the kind of histories and associations, and I think actually whilst on one level we could see that it has this kind of blank canvas possibility, it also in protest it's possible to draw on the histories and trajectories of it, and once it is established as a kind of protest item or linked to particular kinds of movements, whether that's civil rights or feminist protests, you can see that actually in the act of wearing that you are drawing on that and you are activating that history, and I think it's become quite established in that way.
Lovely. Harris?
There's also the element of uniformity, and if you're going to be trying to rally people together to be able to march together and to have that kind of unification is something that is so utilitarian, and everyone or many people have denim in their wardrobe, so that ability to be able to walk en masse and be en masse and have a togetherness, I think denim definitely has that capacity. And also, as both Sophie and Tiwirayi are saying, there's that the ability to reclaim kind of past histories through it. So in terms of the dungarees, which would have been used in cotton fields by people working, in this kind of instance, they're not denying any of those past histories, but they're able to actually stand defiantly regardless of whatever their past might refer to, and actually stand up and be counted.
Fantastic.
I completely agree with what you've just said. I think today, like with the Black Lives Matter movement and how a lot of young people were wearing denim as well, I think a lot of people still don't know the history of denim. So I think right now it's more of an unconscious thing whereby people are wearing what's accessible to them rather than like knowing everything. Do you know what I mean? But yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks. Great.
I agree with everything that's been said, and I guess to add just a sort of a different point would be a kind of practicality. The thing that sort of popped in my head as you were asking the question was a memory of my dad. When he used to go, when he was involved in the miners' strike as a sort of a young man in his mid-20s, he had this jacket that he still has. It's one of those things that we were on about before, and he used to take that because he probably knew he was going to get into a scuffle with the police, and it was, you know, fairly tough wearing, but also he used to chuck it on barbed wire fences so they could scale over and get into pits and stop drivers coming out. So there's a practicality to it as well, and it's like it becomes a sort of a disobedient object in its own right, really, in that it aids something that it's not intended for, but can aid the protest or its aims and ambitions in another way, I guess.
Like a kind of armour, almost, like protective clothing, which is why it was used for workwear as well. Yeah, absolutely. If we could have the next slide, please. Thanks. Harris, This is some of your work that you've created, and you often describe yourself as a visual storyteller, which is just a fantastic way of describing yourself, or, you know, as anyone. It's lovely. So what role does denim play in the stories that you tell? And I mean, especially this one, but in general also.
So this image is from a project that I worked on. There's a company called The Vintage Showroom. They're based in London. They formerly had a shop which had to close during COVID, and they have a vintage showroom which has a selection of workwear and militaria from the 1950s up to the 1980s, and some slightly above and below that time period. And so they consult for this denim mill in Turkey called Orta, and so whenever they do shoots, they always bring me on board to be able to help realise that vision in terms of how they've treated the denim and how they've worked the denim with the different dyeing techniques and washing techniques. And so this was called Future Hunter-Gatherers, and it was looking at a nomadic tribe of people that could best explore how these denim outfits had been turned into smocks and boiler suits and jumpsuits in a way that would have that utility feeling, but not particularly tied to any particular race, region, but actually this standalone group of people. And then within my work in general, claiming that title a number of years ago of visual storyteller, it's that point where whether I work commercially or from a personal point of view, it's how best to share narrative in my work. It's really important to be able to communicate with, if I'm working with a brand, it's often about how to best get them understand either their own brand culture and understand about the different cultures that they work with. So for me, how to communicate with different audiences and different groups, whether it's on a personal level or on a much bigger level, it's how best can I create visual narrative that will hopefully encourage debate or conversation and not just a full stop, which of old, when I'd be employed to work with different brands, you're just there to kind of often paint by numbers. And in terms of the way that I work, it's very much about how can we get much more out of the brief so that there'll be a bit more longevity in whatever it is that we're trying to create.
Fantastic. And we have some more, if we could go to the next slide, please. So this is Jocks and Nerds Tokyo and High Snobiety, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the black and white image is a shoot that I did with one of my favourite Japanese photographers, Tatsuo Suzuki. He's a documentary street photographer, and this was the first fashion editorial that he'd ever shot. And I just really love his approach in the way that he would just document everyday people in and around Shibuya and Shinjuku. And the gilet top that's being worn is by a label called Share Spirit, a designer that I've known for about 15 years. And Hikaru, whenever he works, he always manages to kind of involve really intricate ways of aging whatever material that he's working with, be that leather, be that jewellery. Often will wear Hikaru's rings. And so it's working with people that the ways in which they either look at image or manipulate fabric, but presenting them in a new way. And then the other image was a project that I did for the hype website, High Snobiety. I was really fascinated by lowrider culture in Japan on one of my trips there. I'm fortunate enough pre-COVID to travel to Japan 2-3 times a year, and so really immersed myself within different subcultures, and I've got a lot of connections and a real strong affinity for Tokyo in particular, but Japan in general. And so one of my Friday nights, it was raining. I was walking back to my hotel, and there were these bouncing American cars that would just come around the corner, one after the other, and I just thought it felt like I was in this movie set. And then doing a bit of research, and there's certain Fridays that these guys from a few hours out of Tokyo will drive in, they'll park their cars, and very much like what the films or videos of West Coast Americana, these Japanese, usually men, have pimped up their cars to immaculate perfection, And so when I was commissioned to do this shoot for High Snob, it made sense that I would bring those cars into it. And the brand that we were doing this feature on is a brand called Doublet. And Doublet have this ironic take on Americana and also Japanese what might be deemed as lowbrow culture, in terms of how they will take the mundane that people don't normally regard and use that within their advertising. And so this collection happened to be perfect because it was their Japanese take on an 80s American type image, which then I was able to use with American cars used in a Japanese way. So it was, and then the boy that I cast, which is somebody that I'd seen outside of a shop, and I just really loved his attitude, and which was very non-classic, which is very often, there's a very polite nature within Japanese culture, and this kid had this kind of energy that I really gravitated towards. And so he was, I think, 17, and he was outside the store smoking, and I just thought, yeah, this perfect kind of energy that I wanted to bring to the shoot.
And how did your relationship, your working relationship and personal relationship with Japan begin?
I studied interior architecture, and I had this burning bee in my bonnet to go to Japan in the late 90s, and my girlfriend at the time was working out there, so I got to go and visit Japan through my studies and love of architecture. And then post finishing uni and getting to work in fashion and working as a fashion stylist and working with different brands, there was this brilliant label that used to have this immaculate cross between Victoriana and military stall in Portobello, and I made good friends with them, and they were invited to start doing fashion shows with all of their combined collections in Japan, so they invited me to come and style the collections. And from then I built my own relationships with different individuals and brands in Japan, and that was in the early 2000s. And so since then through till now, I just have this real strong bond with Japan, so it's kind of essentially my home from home.
Do you have any idea when you might be able to go?
At the moment, no. I've had a few conversations over the past year with some of my clients, and some of them, even though they're fully in the pandemic, are still, so can you come next month? I'm like, no, it's not possible.
Yeah.
But I was meant to go out last year to do a project on the Olympics, but then that got put aside. I'd like to hope that next year would come. I do genuinely miss it, because it's not normally a 6-month period where I don't get to go there or get to do projects in Europe with Japanese either clothing or clients. But yeah, hopefully soon.
Yeah, fingers crossed, fingers crossed. Now on that point, I just wanted to leap back to Sophie, to another couple of the global denim projects as well, in relation to Harris's work in Japan. So a couple of the other projects on the site are made in Japan, and Kojima, the jeans town in Japan. Could you just tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, sure. So both projects were carried out by someone called Philomena Keat, and I think they're really fascinating, because I think the relationship between Japan and denim is in itself really fascinating. So Kojima is they call it kind of the denim place, where denim aficionados kind of go and they visit it and they see all the places it's, denim's made and things. And it's kind of got an artisan quality to it, so rather than being a kind of any mass-produced sort of thing. And it's kind of like the opposite of what I was talking about with the London denim and the ordinariness. This is not people who are kind of wearing it to not stand, there's this real kind of insider knowledge around it. And in terms of kind of the production, this artisanal production of denim in Japan, I think what's really interesting coming out of that research is that when there was a kind of some of the denim that was produced in Japan in sort of the 1970s, 80s was very very much kind of copies of American jeans, and it was like the sort of copies or the branding from America. But what happens is you get this really interesting shift to made in Japan, almost being this most desirable quality of jeans, and interestingly associated with authenticity. And I think that's particularly fascinating because they make the jeans more authentic by using all of the kind of what they consider to be sort of original stuff. So they get the old decommissioned Levi's looms, and they use all of the original stuff that the earliest Levi's were made of. So these are kind of, you know, obviously from America, but they make them in Japan, and they use hand-dyed indigo, which takes a lot longer, it's more uneven, but all of these things are seen to contribute to a more authentic pair of jeans, and these are made in Japan. And so it's really interesting how kind of authenticity in jeans gets produced in this particular local context, because it takes this kind of American heritage, but then it turns it into Japanese because of where it's made, and also this very strong attention to detail, and almost the process of making is more important than anything else. So it's a really fascinating relationship between Japan and denim.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, in the manifesto for a study of denim, you write that around a quarter of all American dollar bills are made of denim waste, which I think is just such a fantastic fact. It's so infused with symbolism that it's just so rich, amazing. Now this leads me on to think about reuse. So if we could have the next slide, please. So thinking about reuse and re-evaluating the end of life of products, which is a big theme in your latest venture, Harris. This is images of latings. And I know you've also spoken about the importance of your relationship, not only with Japan, but also with Jamaica. And this is sort of celebrating African diaspora more broadly. Yeah. So if you could talk about all of that, please.
Okay. So language is really important, and over the past year and a half, especially at a time where I wasn't able to travel, and it's not just Japan, but fortunate enough to be able to travel, used to be able to travel a lot for work, that point where a lot of my inspiration would come through the places that I visit, and I genuinely was really excited about coming to Blackburn today because I've never been here before, and just that idea that people watching and being able to take reference and take note of how other people interact, and just the general demeanour is always really fascinating. And where I wasn't able to mobilise and move about, conversation became really key to so much of what I do, as I guess with everyone else. But the idea that conversation has now become that point, a stronger design tool that I will use in terms of not being able to go out and look at visual referencing, but a lot of the dialogue that I have with people will end up sparking a lot of ideas where otherwise it would be seen through the day-to-day. So Latings, originally the name Latings came from, there was a letting shop on the Old Kent Road in southeast London. About 4 years ago, I was driving home, and the first T from the word lettings of this lettings agency had dropped off. And I just thought, this is genius. It's this combination of French and the word tings, which is a Jamaican term, which is used as a euphemism for everything. And I just thought, at some point, I want to be able to use that. I've got no idea how, but I just love that. I just love that as a phrase. And so over the past few years, there's been this development where starting to think about the breakdown of language and almost the loss of some oral traditions, which a lot of the African diaspora would use, be that through proverbs or psalms or sayings or songs, and the idea that as we progress through culture, the way that we use language gets abbreviated and changed, and certain things end up being discarded. And I'd seen this image of this woman, I don't know which part of the African continent she was in, with all of these colourful graphic rice bags around her, and I just loved that as a visual. And so over a couple of years I was asking different friends who were going to different parts of Africa if they could bring these bags back, but no one could find them anywhere, and they kept bringing back Hessian type coffee sacks. And then somebody was in Accra in Ghana, and they sent me this picture on WhatsApp. I was like, that's it. And then started doing a lot more research. And so The latings bags that we create are made from rice bags which have then been discarded or used as storage material in the market. But the idea of latings isn't about it being a brand. We are creating product to sell, but it's the idea of a conversation and a narrative. And the bags, even though they're associated or presented as coming from Africa, they originate, the rice comes from either Thailand or China. So there's this whole trans narrative that goes into the products that we create. And so each bag is handmade, they're found in the markets. We work with this organisation called the Revival Earth, and they work in Cantamanto market, which is Ghana's largest second-hand market. And in Ghana alone, they receive 15 million items a week, which are sent by the likes of the US and us. So I'm starting to kind of explore the idea that what we give give to charity and think we're doing a good thing actually just ends up as landfill and waste in places like Cantamanto. So the Revival work very closely with with a few people, because there's over 30,000 traders from Monday to Saturday that work in Cantamanto market, and there's a few of the men and women that collect these rice bags. And so we'll do these WhatsApp video conferences where they'll be in the market selecting these bags, and then usually someone that works with us at the Tings or a friend will be bringing these rice sacks back with them in a suitcase, and it's built up. It's just been something that's been building over time, but it's about trying to tell a story of migration. It's telling a story about oral traditions, and also the idea that where certain things that would be deemed as waste, there's almost this reverse cycle where we send a lot of our fast fashion or things that we don't want onto their shores, and it's the idea of how can, from the diaspora, see something that would be deemed as not having any worth, turning it into something that could be quite desirable and valuable, and reselling it back in the global north. And how, so it's about playing about with conversation, playing around with identity. I love graphics, symbols. Again, that harks back to a lot of my trips to Japan. There's a lot of cartoon imagery that is used within branding and within industry, and so it's had to have something that's quite fun but has quite a poignant story, but then is also able to be used in a way for utility.
I love it. It's fantastic, and I just love the way they look as well. It's brilliant. Now, I also wanted to ask you about the Return of the Rude Boy project that you created with the photographer Dean Chalkley, which might be the last time I saw you. We were trying to work out when we last saw each other. That's a really long time ago. So this was an exhibition initially on at Somerset House, and also became a book as well. So could you please explain a bit more about this, and also as we're thinking about the globalization, global stories, global strands. This is not Return of the Rude Boy, as yet. This is Craig's work, which I'll come on to shortly. But do you think that Rude Boy style is a global language? Could you explain what it is?
Definitely. It was an incredibly exciting project that Dean and I worked on, and it came about from us both being aware of noticing that there was a bit of a change in the way that certain people that we either worked with or came across in London were expressing themselves very differently. This was from looking at 2012 into 2013, and I'd been doing a project with LCF on Rude Boys for their second year menswear, and my heritage is Jamaican, so Rude Boy is a term that I'm aware of, but not something that would be not something that I'd referenced before in my work. And it became really apparent that there was this way in which people that were expressing themselves that had this defiant attitude and similar almost silhouettes back to the 1950s, early 60s kind of incarnation of what Rude Boy meant with its origins, not so much the more mod two-tone element, which is in the late 70s, which is still part of the story. So we, over a year and a half period, we photographed 65 men and women, predominantly men, and were able to exhibit at Somerset House in the summer of 2014. It was an amazing exhibition which had over 65,000 people come through, which was really remarkable because it was an unfunded project, something that we just took on our own backs, and working commercially never really understood how the art side of things worked, but it's just something that we both really believed in really strongly and something that we needed to share. And then the following year, one of my clients in Japan, Takeo Kikuchi, he sponsored the show to come to Tokyo, so we got to show Return of the Rude Boy in Japan for a week in 2015, and then that's where we launched the book. And little plug, there's a few copies of the book that I brought with me, which are on the table at the back.
Oh, well, that's very handy. So you can all have a look and buy the books and get a much greater understanding of Rude Boy style and the global nature of it. So that's brilliant. Thank you. Excellent. If we could have the next slide, please. Brilliant. Thanks. So Craig, this is your book, In Loving Memory of Work, a visual record of the UK miners' strike, 1984 to 85. Can you tell us about this and how it came about?
Yes, I can. This was a really personal project, as you might have detected from the Emmerdale accent. I'm from Yorkshire, a little town called Barnsley, but I come from a family that's, generations and generations of coal miners. Dad was a miner, my great-granddad was a miner, and every kind of family that I grew up around or in Barnsley always had a miner or more than one miner within it. And I'm, colloquially termed a strike bairn in Barnsley because I was born in 1985 as this miners' strike was ending. So I wasn't there, but I grew up in this kind of post-industrial kind of landscape and watched my kind of town get ignored and kind of decay because no one had jobs, and that kind of exodus that happened as a result of this massive employment opportunity sort of just not being there like overnight, really. And I kind of ignorantly, I guess, as a kid, that kind of thing when you're a kid, you just think everybody's got the same upbringing kind of thing. I just thought everybody knew what this thing was. I thought everybody had, coal not door stickers in the shed and all this kind of stuff around them. And my childhood was littered with these kind of visual, I guess, triggers of what that time period was. And 30 years later, as the sort of 30th anniversary was coming up, I was sort of just idly chatting around the strike and things like that, and decided, in a kind of on a whim really, that I felt like this was something that had been kind of willfully ignored because the miners weren't, I guess, successful in their campaign. What came out of that was actually a really kind of, in my opinion, and what I wanted the book to sort of reappraise, was this outpouring of creativity from working class people, where they had something to say and they were fighting for something, just, their livelihoods, and they dealt with that in a creative way. And I think it was a kind of a kickback against that kind of idea from the middle classes and the ruling classes that working class people are just, thick idiots, really. They're not cultured, they're not really interested in the arts or whatever, And I, couldn't disagree more that I saw all this evidence of people creating stuff, making visuals, writing, doing things that they've never done before in their lives, like performing in front of people in local clubs and fundraising and, writing songs and just taking pictures. And it was just this wonderful thing that happened that had just been suppressed, and I felt that it was time to reappraise that. So that's what this book was about, really. It was about working class creativity from, towns like mine in this kind of, massive sort of this massive struggle that happened, really. And yeah, as I said, it was really personal because my dad was a miner at the time. He was 25, I think, when the strike was on. I was obviously, he was off work, so I'm the fruits of that kind of labour of not being in work. Mum was really heavily pregnant during the strike, although she was really involved in the women's movement, which was, something that I think is really inspiring that came from this kind of struggle. And yeah, we just sort of pulled all these visuals together, went through a lot of archives, spoke to so many people that were there who just sort of came down from their attic or the shed with carrier bags just full of what they would deem as crap. I've got all this crap, do you want it? Or plates and mine has had a weird thing of, commemorating everything on a ceramic plate. There's something very British about it, but they're like these beautiful things, and of course the kind of the vernacular of their communities with the banners and all that kind of stuff, and it just collects all of that together to showcase it from a kind of a creative angle, really. There's lots been written on it politically, there's lots been written on it about the history and all of that, but no one really had looked at it from a creative point of view and what these people actually went through and how they processed it themselves through creativity rather than, what it was as a political thing. So that's kind of how it is.
Was it painful for some of them being able to kind of respond in that way, or were people kind of quite open to be able to give off their material in that way?
I think people reacted in it in different ways, really. The most painful thing was watching my dad, like, kind of really try and deal with it. He was arrested at Grieve, which is the picture you can see of Leslie there, about to be battered, but that's my dad getting arrested in the colour photo, with his jeans on, I might add. And as I said, like, his treatment by the police and what he faced there, he just obviously just sat on it for years and years and years. And I actually went to Grieve with him, and we walked through, which it's all like a housing estate now. And he literally ran away. He got home somehow. I didn't know where he'd gone. He didn't speak to me for a week. Couldn't get hold of him. And he'd sort of had to confront it all again. But he was there with me at every kind of interview. Whenever we went to, just somebody's house, we travelled all over just to sort of meet people and have a chat with them, and, a cup of tea or a beer or whatever it was. And he'd come and he'd sit with them, and I think in a way he was like the key to it, because he gave me a little bit of validity. It was a really sensitive thing for a lot of people, because they'd been approached by journalists and people saying, "Oh, we're on your side," and then they'd give them the story, and then they'd only to see what these people did, and a lot of them felt betrayed by it. So I think there was a bit of hesitancy with, who's this young lad coming and saying he wants all this stuff from me, but my dad being there and, just talking about regaling him about all these stories down the pit, all that. But even that humour, it was good. And I think another thing that really kind of sticks in my mind about that process with people was they were completely kind of ignorant to what they'd done, like what they'd made. Like, they didn't see any value in it, they didn't see any kind of credibility to it. It was, it's almost like like when you show kids, young kids, like a view of a beautiful place, and you go, look at that, isn't it beautiful? And they're like going, what? Looking for something. It's a bit like that. They sort of they didn't see it, they'd sort of look through it. And I'd be like saying, no, this is really good, because look, you've referenced that, you've sort of done creative problem solving, or you've invented something, or that, even if just like from a copywriting point of view, what you wrote is really powerful. You've summed up this incredible political struggle in 3 words, That's what I get paid to do for a living. Really, putting a finer point on it. So it was, that for me was a lovely side of that, in that I sort of took their work and treated it the way that I see people who are sort of labelled artists, and I gave it that kind of treatment, and I said, this is valuable, this is worthwhile, this is culture, this is where I come from, I see myself in that, and you should be really proud of what you went through and how you articulated it, doing this or that, or making that ceramic plate or whatever. So, yeah.
Now, looking through some of the images from the Battle of Orgreave, including this incredible picture of your dad, it is remarkable how much denim features in these images. But firstly, I was wondering if you could also tell us about the work that you do with the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of fell out of the book, really. It was a self-funded thing. I really wanted to do it. And I just thought, I'm good if I don't do it now, like 30 years, no one celebrates the 31st anniversary or something, I thought, well, I might as well do it now. And we did it all, and I just asked them, really, phoned them up, and just said, I'm doing this book, I'm going to sell it, whatever, can I give you the proceeds? And they were very suspicious. They were a bit, why, So I went to meet them, and it was just a friend of mine appeared at the door at the NUM, National Union Mine Workers, and he was like, "Hey, Craig, what are you doing here?" I was like, "To see you, I think." And from that, the book was really successful in that we sold out really quickly. We did a second edition that went, and they got a lot of kind of cash from that. But through doing it, I think I just got involved with them, and they just said, "Can you help us out with this? Can you help us out with that?" And of course, I was more than happy to do that. And my dad, again, came with me on that, and he told them that he was arrested. And this kind of interview of me trying to tell them I wanted to give them some money turned into them like recording my dad's experience for the fucking thing they were going to file at Parliament. It was mad. But yeah, I mean, I still work with them now, and we do a lot of stuff. I designed their kind of legal documentation that was submitted to Parliament 5 years ago, which was rejected because nobody died. That was their response. Got to love a Tory, haven't you? And yeah, but it was, yeah, pretty hard. I mean, my dad's story, that picture was so weird, and it's so kind of strange, only because, yeah, my dad's in it, but it's flooded with all the main police officers that were then charged at Hillsborough, like they're all there. The guy at the back with the megaphone, he was the chief at Hillsborough, and of course what they did at Grieve, they later repeated at Hillsborough to cover up. So it's this weird image that kind of encapsulates what went on at Grieve, the main people involved, the weird kind of surreal composition of the bloke with his arms out, and then my dad's getting carried away. But the funny thing about it is my dad actually spotted it on Google Images. He was like, "That looks like me." We were actually looking for a sticker that he said he swears down that he had on his miner's helmet that said "Jabba Scab," and I'm convinced this sticker doesn't exist because we couldn't find it fucking anywhere. But and then we found this, and he told me this story about these shoes. These shoes weren't his; they were my granddad's. And my granddad had like told him all the time, stop wearing my best shoes, don't wear my best shoes. And yeah, he wore them and then got arrested, so there was nowhere to hide. He was more scared of my granddad, I think, than the police.
That's remarkable. Can we see the next? Oh yeah, thank you very much. And so we see denim here signifying also its earliest use as workwear, as well as a sort of uniform for protest, I suppose. Why do you think that denim had such a visual presence at the strikes?
Lots of reasons, I think. It's difficult to put one kind of, short answer on that. I think there's a real kind of tie-in of their identity with it. I think they were really kind of proud of where they worked. They were really proud in that kind of solidarity and camaraderie that they had working in a pretty difficult job, fighting the earth for a living underground. There's obviously this sense of solidarity there, because if one of them got their job wrong or didn't do it properly, that literally cost lives. So I think, but they were proud of that, and wearing their workwear outside of that, their helmets, all of that kind of gear, that was all there as well. So I think there's this sense of identity that's so entwined with who they are and what they do as a job. It's kind of weird. It's like a lifestyle more than than just, oh, it's just another job. So I think that is an increased presence. But there's also this kind of weird paradox, I think, and I don't know if this was the miners or just like my kind of community in Barnsley, but denim had this kind of paradox to it in that they'd wear it to work and it'd be scruffy and it'd be full of paint and coal and battered, and it'd be work stuff, and they'd only wear their uniform for work, but then they had effectively the same like jeans, but for best, that they would go out in and go out drinking in, but it's like the same thing. There's that kind of weird thing to it as well. And I think, again, like that I said at the beginning, they knew with the brutality that they were facing on picket lines and on protest marches, they were probably going to be in for a scuffle at some point, so they had to be able to move quickly, they had to be comfortable, and they could use them for other means, which they often did. And again, that kind of creativity, you see the little lad there who's absolutely littered in coal door stickers. There was that kind of level of customization, really, which you see in the other material that they made, the posters and stuff. It's like that kind of post-punk Britain just emerging out of that, painting the denim, painting slogans on them, that becoming their kind of protest costume in a way. That's what this kind of kitchen table creativity, where they just had something to say and it boiled over, and they just grabbed a bit of paint or whatever they had to hand and they made a communication, like a homemade banner. that you see, and you know, pretty much every single woman in there has got denim on. They've all got jeans on, and I think it was just one of those things. There's lots of little moments and triggers as to why it was so important and ingrained in those communities, really.
Absolutely. If we could have the next slide, please. Speaking of women protesting in denim, that's a very good link. Thank you very much. Now, another key moment that we often, that we see in popular culture for denim and protest is figures from second wave feminism, such as Andrea Dworkin, who we can see here. Now, Sophie, I know your work looks at feminist theory as well. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts as to why, at this particular moment on the left, denim dungarees became such a stereotype of the feminist.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there is, on one level, there's the explicit and conscious wearing of denim for political reasons, but then there's also the ways in which actually simultaneously there is people wearing denim as it being something that they did anyway, and then the association of that with feminists comes from other people. And so I think both of those things are going on at the same time, but I think some of it is also about politically what they're rejecting, and I think there's a very definite rejection with second wave feminism of femininity, of the patriarchal beauty culture, of anything which is kind of associated with stereotypes of femininity, but also the ways in which actually that has connotations of impracticality. And I think in lots of ways denim, in different ways we can see how it is comfortable, it is practical, you know, it's got those histories of workwear, but it also as a fabric is hardy, it's tough, you know, and I think actually in lots of ways denim then becomes the perfect fabric to reject those kind of sense of restrictions and lack of comfort. And I think the other reason is also the ways in which maybe we can think about, although denim is worn by men and women, it has, in some of its history, certainly connotations with masculinity, and I think in its early histories. And so in lots of ways then it becomes the perfect medium to reject femininity, because it's about the taking on of those masculine connotations and being freed from, I guess, a lot of those restrictions.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And the image of me here, this is one of the anti-austerity marches, one in 2015 here, which I actually went to on my own, and I bumped into a friend of mine who was a photographer just as we got to Downing Street, quite perfectly. But on this particular march, and it's, you know, unfortunately one of many, many, many marches I've gone on in the past few years because everything's awful. I really noticed on this one in particular in 2015 that there were so many people wearing dungarees, so many women in particular wearing dungarees. And I really couldn't stop thinking about the sort of Andrea Dworkin second wave, but also there was something very Rosie the Riveter about it. Like it was like this real kind of, you know, let's get things done kind of feel. So I think there's no denying that sometimes these things can intersect with ideas of what's fashionable, because there were just so many women in dungarees that I was like, this isn't just a protest thing, this is also definitely a fashion thing that's happening, which I think has continued. So I wanted to ask all of you, why do you think there is such a fashion for workwear at the moment? Whether it's dungarees, whether it's chore jackets, like we see it a lot. Do you think this has any kind of symbolic meaning? I'll start with Craig.
Don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of thinking of designers like Margaret Howell and people, you know, that sort of their entire career is built on making things, you know, what they would say, I guess, making things to last, and that idea of workwear being, you know, the story of the material almost intrinsically becoming, you know, puntastic here, like woven together with the sort of the occupation or the vocation in which it serves. You know, I think people, particularly now, I think that doesn't really exist anymore. You know, we don't really have those kind, you know, as we're all digital or working from home, and generations of, you know, digital natives or whatever they're calling them now, you know, they don't have those experiences per se. They don't necessarily have workwear in that kind of strong sense. So I think there's almost this kind of retroness to it that they identify with, which I think is why those kinds of things might be popular, because it's just not a thing anymore, really. And it's like when you see, it's a bit theme park, isn't it? It's like coffee shops pretending they're industrial when they're not at all, you know. There's that kind of thing about it, that kind of dress up, that search for authenticity, I guess. They're not carpenters or, you know, miners or whatever, but they might wear a miner's jacket. They might not even know that it's a miner's jacket, but, you know, it's all sort of tied up in it. And I think that's why it's important, like a lot of the work that you've spoken about, like telling people those stories of where things come from, why material is what it is, the histories that they're tied up with, whether it's, you know, social upheaval and social change or politics or whatever. I think people need to know what they're wearing and where it comes from in order to, you know, fit that bill, really. So I don't know, maybe that for 5 minutes is what my thoughts might be.
That's great.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you've just said. I also think that it's also like a trend kind of thing, where people see that people are wearing certain things and they'll also want to wear them too. Especially with denim, I feel like denim's so comfortable, like when you're marching, when you're spending like hours on end, like out there at protests and stuff, like it's just convenient as well. So I think it's unconscious, but it's also conscious.
Great, thank you.
I think it's kind of, well, it's multi-layered, but I mean, a number of years ago, heritage became this thing which came back, especially into menswear, and it became one of these buzzwords where so many, I remember going to trade fairs where so many brands would almost have identikit kind of workwear jackets and all those the French kind of linen jackets, and it was something that then just seeped especially into menswear. And then just thinking about it now, because there's the idea that not everyone has one fixed job, and where people might have used to have something a bit more formal that they would wear to work, and then they would have their civvies or their casual clothes when they're at home, where especially over the last few years where people have had to start adapting to kind of new ways of working and having different kinds of jobs. The idea that having something that's quite utility just means that there's a versatility that you can go from doing one job here and then flip into something else. And so there's a flexibility which means that actually I can still look smart, almost like what you were saying, but people are maybe even more aware now that actually I could still wear these jeans or this jacket for this and for that, and there not being any cultural mores about denim or workwear having any stigmas attached to it, apart from actually it looks stylish, it's fairly simple, and you can also blend in quite easily as well, so there's almost a camouflage aspect where actually I can just get on and not actually stand out too much. I think it's, yeah, the change in the ways in which many people work means that utility in denim is much more applicable to the way people live.
Great. Sophie?
I think that there is, you know, it certainly is a fashion, but I think what's really interesting is how we might be told at various points what is in fashion, but it doesn't become in fashion unless people take it on. And I think actually, when I did this project, when I worked in Nottingham-Trent, we did this project on street style, and it was looking at what magazines said was in fashion, what shops said was in fashion, and what people were actually wearing. And it's really interesting to see certain things we're told they're in fashion, but nobody ever wears them. And so are they ever really a fashion if people don't take them up? Or things that are supposed to just be a kind of flash in the pan, like Ugg boots. They were meant to just be there for one season, and they stayed and they stayed and they stayed. And I think there's something in there about some things resonate with people. People adapt their wardrobes to them. People feel comfortable in them. They want to wear them. And I think there's something about utility clothing, and certainly definitely something about denim, that it resonates with people and that they feel comfortable in it. It fits with what they want to wear. It fits with the mood of the times. And so it kind of takes off. And I think that's what's happened with this utility trend. I think that it isn't something that's come from elsewhere and people are told this is what's in fashion. It fits with what people want to do, and it is comfortable, and you are able to do different things in it. And if there's no longer a kind of taboo on you know, dungarees. I remember when I first got a pair of dungarees about 8 years ago, I was thinking, can I wear them to work? I have no dress code at work. Can I wear them? And I thought I can do it. And now I see people at work wearing them, and I think obviously those kind of taboos have gone, haven't they? And so it just becomes more permissible.
Fantastic. Thank you all for your insights. And so now I wanted to open it up to the audience, essentially. Do you have any questions?
Mike.
So I'm just going to briefly summarise that so that it's on the recording as well. Talking about the 70s and 80s and the protests that were happening then, some of which we've covered this evening, but how there was also a reaction in terms of these very flamboyant cultures like glam rock, things like that developing as well, which doesn't seem to be happening now. And do people have any thoughts on why that might be, or on that in general? Craig?
I think there's quite a lot of points there, but I think for me it's like from like hardship, you tend to get like a sort of a subculture, or many subcultures, like what you identified. They tend to come out of those things as like I was sort of hinting at, as people deal with things, they tend to process them and they come out in other means that they might not be used to. Plus, if there's no opportunities for people, they tend to make their own, or they try to do something else, or they're forced to do it, whatever. So I think a lot of them come out of that. But I think the main thing for me that I thought as you were asking the question is between the sort of 70s and 80s, the upheaval, the kind of the behaviour, the kind of dress, and now is I think it's harder to know who the bad guy is now. I think everybody's so fucking evil, from your corporations to your politicians, you know, they're all at it. And I think I still think it's harder to, you know, identify the kind of the source of that pain, or the person or individual or thing that you need to kind of attack. That, you know, the miners, you know, they knew who they were going for. Right now, it's like, you know, who do you go for now? You know, when Facebook's more powerful than your own government, but they're both you know, doing really kind of horrible things. And I think that is, in a way, suppressed a little bit of that disobedience, because I think it's where do you aim, what do you do? It can feel fruitless, I think. And obviously that's not the case. That's not a, you know, not everybody does that. Obviously we still protest things and we still move, but I think it is much more difficult for people. And I think just it's moved, like the kind of landscape of work has shifted, as we sort of said. Like, people do things much more fluidly now, and there's not a sort of this and that, you know, terms to how you're upbringing. It's not like work and play anymore. It's all that sort of do what you love shit, you know. That bleeds into your life and your work now, and everybody's trying to make a living doing the hobby, essentially. So I think that's another thing why you don't see a kind of direct correlation. But it's scary, isn't it, that it is that bad.
Yeah. Sorry, can you reiterate the question?
Sorry. Laurie was saying that in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of some of the protests we've seen today were happening. A lot of sort of social issues, basically, that were being protested about, a lot of economic issues as well. But we also saw a flowering of sort of countercultural or subcultural movements like glam rock, which were really flamboyant, really dressing up, which we're arguably not seeing today. And why might that be, even though we are going through a period where there is a lot of protest a lot of the time?
With that, I'm not too sure how much I can contribute, but I think it's also a thing where sometimes people don't want to cloud what they're wearing with the cause. Sometimes it is solely for the cause, so people might be dressing more on a simpler kind of wavelength than the flamboyancy that they used to. I don't know. That's just my thought.
I wonder if the internet has anything to do
Definitely.
with it.
From my point of view, 100%. When style tribes started to fade away and the digital revolution started to come in, where so many of us are indoctrinated with how the algorithms tell us what we should be looking at and what we see, and even though we're not fully aware of it. And I think it's multi-layered, it's not just as simple or as binary as that, but where growing up you could quite easily tell someone who was into the Ramones, or if they were into hip-hop or rave or whatever it was, which was great in some senses because it brought together like-minded people, but then it also created certain exclusion zones where if you weren't fully in that club you would be ostracized or not be able to be part of that. And so much of what we see and what we're taught to buy, it's very much about trying to make us almost feed into a homogenization where individuality isn't really celebrated that much. So even though New Romantics, or if you're into glam rock, there would have been small groups, but those were really loud minorities that were able to make their presence felt. And just very often, if you choose to express yourself, it's not always encouraged in that way. Quite often people will learn that actually if I stand out, it won't be easy for me to get a job, or won't be easy for me to kind of move forward. So very often if you've got to end up making a choice between actually, am I going to express who I am, or am I going to be able to move along in society, some of those kind of sensibilities often get hammered out. So, and personally I love one of the reasons I love going to Japan is because you can just be who you want and there's no scrutiny or no judgment, whereas very often I love the cynical nature of being a Brit, but actually sometimes that cynicism also actually squeezes out some of that natural creativity that might be able to kind of permeate through society.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Sophie?
Two things. One is, I think that actually the ways in which these kind of style differentiations emerge at the moment they're very subtle, and so whereas I think, and that links to the points that you were making, that actually you could easily identify someone and what music they liked and where they went, and I had a student who did a project last year, and it was on these kind of exclusive sportswear brands, and how the people who kind of wore them, they were sort of in this, what you might call a kind of style grouping. And actually, the forms of differentiation are so subtle that if you're not part of that group, you would have no idea. I would have no idea that these groups even existed. And so I think on one level, these are so subtle kinds of forms of differentiation that they're still there, but they're much harder to see if you're not kind of in the know. And then the other thing I wanted to say was that I think that actually fashion is kind of the bad guy in lots of ways here, in that I was thinking about, I went into Manchester city centre in the evening a couple of days ago. It's the first time I've done it since pre-pandemic, and there were all these people dressed up, and girls in massively high heels, and I'd forgotten that world even existed. And it struck me that actually there is this world, and it's not necessarily in any way flamboyant or kind of fancy dressing, but this is that hideous, cheap, disposable, pretty little thing fashion, and that's there, and it kind of is the bad guy actually. And I think that is so anathema to any idea of kind of politics or protest, that I think a lot of people want to distance themselves from that as well. So I think that kind of element is there as well.
There was only one thing that just sprung to mind. I was just thinking like drag culture. I feel like that is one thing that is, known for its flamboyancy, but has really come into, I guess, mainstream
Yeah.
recently, and it's so political and it's so fucking brilliant. Like, I guess that is one thing that does kind of book that trend. But yeah, just thought.
I think that's a good point, actually. Last week, with my students, we were looking at a video by Lil Nas X, which was just incredible and so flamboyant and so unlike any music video I saw when I was growing up, that I was like, oh, this is what kids are watching now. They're going to be great. This is brilliant. Yeah. Any other questions?
I was going to say, I can really talk to our students today about this, but if you think about it, I was a new romantic. It was fantastic flea markets, there was brilliant fabric shops. Like now, it is the fast fashion that they go to, and people kind of feel it's more expensive to make something, isn't it, than to buy like something cheap. So I can see how, and you do see how people, fashion students used to know who they were. You used to look, oh, that's a fashion shoe. Now, it could be any student. We sometimes tell us, oh, dress up a bit, put some makeup on. You're encouraging it, but they don't. Even fashion students we're finding now are scared to go above the pulpit and like stand out. Whereas in our day, people would go down the street and sing, oh, what's she wearing today as she goes out, But you didn't care, Whereas I think now it's so sad that the youngsters, they care too much about what people say about them all the time. And it's this constant, what's she wearing, what are her eyebrows like, what kind of eyelashes she. It's so detailed about what they're like and what they're wearing. It's incredibly hard for youngsters, I think.
To be honest, I agree with that, because I feel like as young people, we spend so much time on the internet, Gen Z in particular, like we're known as the internet generation. We've grown up on the internet, we've grown up watching YouTube videos, we've grown up with Instagram, we've grown up with Snapchat, all of these things that have filters and influencers and all of this kind of stuff, that sometimes it is hard to kind of understand who we are just for looking in ourselves. We're looking at other people constantly. So I think that is definitely like a big issue.
And for me, in response to your point, which kind of almost goes back to some of what Craig was saying, what I find quite a bit of a travesty, the fact that growing up in the 80s and 90s, where there wasn't any internet, I grew up knowing about the miners' strike all the time. It's something that kind of was very omnipresent with what was happening politically. And I'd say now, because we can be so, or young people, or many of us can be so easily distracted by a lot of these heinous ills that are going on, there isn't that connection. So back then, the idea of being able to shop in that way wasn't even an option, whereas now it's just very easy for us to be able to dispose of our cash in that way. And so to be able to fully have political mindsets, especially from working class communities, for me it's quite scary that even if you weren't down with the miners, you'd be fully aware of what was going on, be it about that particular issue or other issues. So for me, it's the sadness that actually our attention can be diverted while all of this other stuff is going on, and actually the politicisation of buying from Boohoo or Pretty Little Thing or whoever it is actually is what gains the attention and the finance of young people, of many generations. And so I also kind of struggle with actually how we've kind of been duped by so much of what is going on.
I think that's an interesting point. To give a slight counter narrative to that as well, as the same generation growing up in the 80s and 90s and being labelled, or people slightly older than me being labelled the slacker generation, I actually think it's interesting. A lot of young people are very politicised today, and especially over things like the climate crisis. It's unavoidable for young people. So I think that, but the news itself can almost become one of those distractions, because there is so much news and we have access to so much news that in itself, and it goes back to this, there's just stuff to protest about all the time. That in itself can be a distraction. You're like, well, it's this cause, but there's also that cause, and there's that, and there's that, and now this thing's happened, and that itself can be a cacophony of concerns. One final question I think we've got time for. If anyone has a final question. Yes. So the ultimate question was, why is it that denim is such a powerful expression of culture? Would you say that's an adequate summing up? Yeah, great. Why would you say that denim is such a powerful expression of culture? Any thoughts on that as closing thoughts?
I guess because it's so malleable, you can kind of do anything with it. It's a great vehicle for, you know, whether you want to express that your culture is about craft or whatever, or whether it's, you know, about expression or whatever. It can take all those forms and still kind of it lives that kind of paradoxical life of being this utilitarian thing that everybody has access to, but it can be so individual. And I think it's that, really. I think it's just that facility that it offers, that it can just convey whatever you want it to do. You can be made into almost anything you want it to be made into, and can be, you know, modified, changed, or created, or evolved in whatever way you want to do it. You know, you can make it in a way that will tell a story, rather than itself, you know. So I think it's all of those things kind of washed in together.
I think in addition to that, I think denim is timeless as well. So regardless of whatever form you choose to wear denim, whether it be, I was saying before, like a skinny jean or a wide leg jean or a denim jacket, overalls, that kind of thing, regardless of when it is, it will always be in. It will always be some kind of a trend, and in that whole fashion cycle that, you know, we go through as well.
I think it's just got denim has an amazing ability to carry memories, and it's something that we carry from our youth as we get older, and there's that affinity where actually it can reference from whether it was we were just rolling down the hill in the park, right through to going out clubbing, through to whatever it might be, but there's that affinity that it holds so many precious kind of moments and times, and that identity that also goes with it.
Lovely.
I mean, I think some of it is about the materiality of denim as well, and that the ways in which actually it is a clearly recognisable thing. You know, it is a thing which kind of creates that possibility for shared style, but it's also got the ways in which it's woven and the ways in which it's dyed means that it does age and take on the shape of the wearer. So the materiality has in it that possibility for personalisation, uniformity, but also differentiation, and because of that it lends itself to, you know, different kind of either individual styles but also you know, cultural kind of particular cultural style groupings around it. But I think that the other thing is also about the history, is that actually there are multiple histories. There is no one history or story of denim, and actually something that we found with the Global Denim Project is if you look at different countries and different locations, that actually they have their own histories, and as a consequence it's not kind of reducible to being from one place and therefore part of that kind of culture. It's actually lots of different places take it on as their own, and I think it's kind of unique in that in clothing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for your incredible insights, and thank you for your questions and for sticking with us as well. It's fantastic. To give you some information on where you can find out more what our panellists are currently doing, Sophie had a book out earlier this year called Material Methods with Sage Publications, looking very much at these material culture, what we can learn from objects or how we can study objects and understand ourselves better, I suppose. Craig has designed a book called Flashback, which is currently for sale in the pop-up shop. This is, broadly speaking, about acid house in Blackburn, and that sort of subcultural movement. It's designed by Craig, it's published through Rough Trade Books, and it's by Jamie Holman and Alex Zawadsky. Harris, his Leting's shop is opening, the online store is opening later in November, so please do check it out, www.letings.co, and you can find them on Instagram as well. Tiwirayi's British Textile Biennial show is on until the end of the month in the mall in Blackburn. Hopefully you've all seen it already. Even if you have, go back and see it again. You can catch my show for the biennial, Cloth Cultures, on at the Haworth Art Gallery, also in Accrington, also till the end of the month. And there's a related Cloth Cultures podcast, which you can listen to, which also features, which I interviewed Tiwirayi as well as a number of other artists involved in the biennial. And you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. In terms of the conversations and creativity, I'm nearly finished. You can nearly go after the video. We have one final event coming up. It's an online event, so you can watch it wherever you have an internet connection. Cloth Connections, Colonial Impacts on Material Cultures of the African Diaspora. This is created and hosted by Talika Kirkland, a colleague of mine at London College of Fashion. She's the founder of the Costume Institute of the African Diaspora. That's on Thursday evening. It will be streaming and will be available online on the Super Slow Way YouTube account afterwards. In here in the cathedral, we might have a few minutes before we have to leave. You can see Jamie Chalmers' show Stitch Your Story, which is a crowdsourced collection of digital hoops telling stories of migration and belonging. Thank you very much for that, and I think we're going to finish with this video.
Fresco Steez. I'm a cultural engineer. I create supplies for organizers to figure out how they can organize marginalized people to take action through creative design and compounding political analysis and culture. At 13 years old, I was trying to figure out how to transform the conditions that Black folks were living in our communities, and I found organizing. And so at a young age, I was trying to figure out how do we compound these different experiences through things like intersectionality and figure out what liberation, what solutions look like for the most marginalized folks in our community. When I first was approached with this project, I think about a quote from Tony K. Bombaro that says, "The role of the culture worker who belongs to an oppressed people is to make revolution irresistible." That has been a guiding light to how I think about using design, culture, and political struggle, compounding and intersecting those to create things that get Black folks curious. Thinking through Levi's history and the history of political struggle, I think they're intertwined in a way that there are different political movements throughout history. When we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panther Party, when we talk about Zapatistas, farm workers' rights, anti-war movement, there are so many folks dressed down in denim. These different movements of political struggle have created a visual culture through clothing, through art. I can say that an anchoring aspect throughout each of these political struggles has been how people have used denim. And so this collection feels like a culmination of how different activists and organizers have outfitted whole movements to contribute to the cultural identity and the visual identity of those movements. And so Levi has been honored to be adorned throughout those political struggles or political movements. So I'm really proud to be doing this.
Okay, so thank you very much, Craig, Tiwirayi, Harris, and Sophie. Thank you.